We're so pleased, very much welcome to the SSC Riga for this event. I think we have a record today. I think we're passing already over 100. There used to be some latecomers who will be very welcome as well. The school, many of you have been here before, many of you are students here, but I still would just, for the rest, would like to just tell that this is organized by the SSC Riga, and it's a Center for Media Studies, which is kind of a separate little thing that is sponsored by a Swedish foundation that we're very happy, the Under Foundation, who's doing that. And we do seminars like this off and on, open seminars, so you should keep up on checking on our homepage when the next one is up. My name is Hans Manson. I'm the program director for this. I should mention that too. And if any of you have any good ideas on what we should do, you are welcome to talk to me afterwards and see if we can figure that one out too. Whistleblowers are extremely important in our society. The people who are willing to expose and show what illegal activities are going on. The public really needs, the taxpayers really need these brave people to track and protect our common values. And many countries do have pretty good laws protecting whistleblowers, but at the same time, most countries also have laws that make exceptions that excludes the legality of exposing maybe once in a while the worst misconduct or illegal activities that are being done. And you know, many times whistleblowers are funneling their information through media. Most known probably is, at least for the older ones, is the Watergate, the deep throat in the Watergate scandal that forced President Nixon to resign once. Some whistleblowers want to stay hidden, some want to appear, and some are exposed involuntarily. And we have, of course, two very well known now, Bradley, or actually Chelsea Manning, that she wants to be called today, we should be correct with that, and Edward Snowden. There's also one major change that has been happening the last years, which is very natural for you who are younger, and not so natural for me, is not only what and how to expose things, but it's also how to protect whistleblowers. The good thing with the internet, what I'm talking about, there are so many good things with it, and there are so many bad things with it, on the other hand. Being that said, we're so happy to have somebody here who has the inside knowledge of it all, who has been dealing with classified material as a spy in the British MI5. She has experience of being a high-profile whistleblower. She understands the inside of media and how media is manipulated. So, may I present Annie Massion. Here. She has been the intelligence officer at MI5, that's British Security Service, and she resigned in the late 90s to blow the whistle on incompetence and crimes. And I think no one better understands the importance of increased openness and accountability than she does. But before I leave the word to her, Inisa Vojka, who's sitting right here, who is the chair, I believe, of Transparency International in Latvia. Is that correct? Yeah. And she will give an introduction, give a 15-minute introduction to present an alternative to silence, whistleblowing for change. She will not take questions right after that, but after 15 minutes, we'll go straight over to Annie. And then you can have questions to both of them afterwards. So, have I forgotten something? No? Please, Inisa. Oops.
Thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I want to share the little overview of the situation for whistleblowers in Europe today. We in Transparency International, here in Latvia, have been working with colleagues all across Europe, analyzing what is going on, and have come to some conclusions. And why we, being civil society, mobilizing people against corruption, mobilizing governments and businesses against corruption, care about whistleblowing. We have especially come to understand at this moment of day and life of the way the world is going, that corruption is something that is very difficult to fight. Transparency International has now been working over 100 countries around the world. Will celebrate its 20th anniversary this year. We in Latvia have been working on this issue for 15 years. I myself started as an investigative journalist that turned into a civil society fighter 15 years ago. And we have some improvements. We have things that have changed, and we have things that still are not changing. And we are asking what we still need to do to improve it. We have come to understand that there are few important things that really one needs to look at to be able to squeeze corruption to even smaller places and the people who are benefiting from stealing from the public benefit. And that the big picture relates to stopping the impunity, the stopping people getting away with it. People who have power, have resources, who can just do it. People see, notice it, but no influence on this. No legal, or maybe investigations are started, they are finished and dropped. That is one end of it, that the legal system, the law enforcement, the police should really, get their act together. And now I'm talking about Latvia and other countries, and see that those who need to be brought to justice are really done so. But then there is another angle, and that is the beginning of it. So many people see corruption happening in front of our eyes, in the places we work, in the places we interact as business people, and keep silent. Are afraid of announcing it, are afraid of losing their business, are afraid of losing their job. And we really need to work on protecting those who could speak up. We need, and this is where we come to the whistleblowers, that are the people who are seeing it and maybe would like to speak up, but there are different obstacles they are facing. And by the time you are listening to this, you maybe are asking, well, what are you calling? Who is this whistleblower? Of course, for all the continental languages, it is a bit of a challenge, both in language terms and also in the terms of the culture. Is this the announcer, denouncer, the one who talks, denounces his neighbor, the good guy? It's difficult to overcome the totalitarian past in this part of the world. It's difficult to overcome other prejudices that exist on the other side of Europe to really support people who come forward with good. But I can give you a small tip. This is how we view at it. If people are starting to argue with you that, he's bringing a lot of damage, he's not a whistleblower, you can look at the three things. Is what that person is talking about in public interest? Is there a public interest to get to know what we got to know? Do we have reason to believe that this person really knows what he's talking about? Is this true? Does that person believes it's true and can tell us that this is true? And the third one is about legitimacy, which is a bit questionable, and I think Annie will talk about it. Has he done it in a legitimate way? This is why we have come to to understand that in Europe what we need is better whistleblower protection laws, because if there is no procedure and law to protect people who want to disclose wrongdoings, who want to disclose corruption, then this question of speaking up for something that only in a legitimate process is really doubtful. We have the case in Latvia of a famous person who called himself Neo, who happened to find a hole in the state revenue service systems back in the days of crisis 4 years ago, and he went to see what is in there and found relevant information. What he published was the real salaries of the people that were receiving bonuses in public service at the time when public service said we are cutting salaries and there are no more bonuses. If that information would not have gone out, much more money would have gone into the pockets of those who said they are not going to get this money. Yet there is a criminal case against a violation of intruding into the public system of our person whom we consider a whistleblower. For us, Neo is a whistleblower because he was disclosing only public information that was in the public interest. He didn't put everything out that he got, and we can believe that this is true. Yet we have to find out if this is legitimate. Situation in Europe actually is quite sad. It's difficult. Only 2 countries in 27 European Union countries have real decent laws that are protecting whistleblowers. It is Hungary and UK. It has still yet their own problems. We'll hear about there are secrets and secrets with smaller and bigger letters. But only 2 countries have these laws. Few have made progress in the recent years, and 12 even make it not only not protect people who are disclosing such information, but they make it worse for them. So therefore, we really are convinced that actions need to be taken. I mean, laws have to be written, but also culture has to be changed so that this progress can happen. In Latvia, we are facing, I think, if we just started, we can discuss this a little bit after we hear Annie's presentation. What is our take on the people who are bringing information out of the house, like it happened in the Ombudsman's office, or firemen who raised the questions about the procurement, or the recent case of a whistleblower from the castle of Riga, from the museums. She said that the things were not going so well as they were, and she was removed from her job just the next day and moved out. She wasn't fired, but the risk of being fired was very high. So we really want to have a discussion with society at large. Is it really something that we want to make secure? We really want people to speak up for public good and for public change? I wasn't so convinced we can write a law because there is such a big resistance. But new lawyers that came to work for DALNA, for Transparency International here, said, why not? So we should try to see how a separate legislation we could really, open up debate on how really we are encouraging people to speak up, and that we should not really be silent when things go wrong, because only thanks to those people who have courage and are ready to go against the system at the times when things are wrong, real changes in the world are really happening. I was an investigative journalist in my first profession some time ago, and I have seen these people who are courageous to give information to journalists. I have seen these people also in my work with Transparency International, and they really can make a difference in the world, because there are so many people who just want things to be as they are and benefit from it, that I think, you know, it's a shame, and if we don't stand up against it, where you are, where you see it, where you can influence it, where I can influence it, where we can do it together, things can only get worse and not stay where they are, and even not get better. So thank you. This is a grim picture I'm painting. More energy in that we really need to do it, and less vision that how we really can do it with little political interest and little understanding that this is important. But this is the first step and the first event. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, both sessions, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak here, and also to all of you. What a wonderful turnout for my talk, which is called Whistleblowing is the New Rock and Roll. Just out of curiosity, how many of you in the audience are or hope to be journalists? A few. How many of you work in intelligence? No? It's worth a try.
They are not allowed to show you off. They have.
I'm sure, yes, there's usually a little friend. Anyway, just to reassure them, everything I say today is already in the public domain, so I will not be breaking any laws. So yes, my talk is called Whistleblowing is the New Rock and Roll, and I was invited to do this talk a few months ago, and who could have foreseen the landscape we'd now be looking at with the trial of Chelsea Manning, and, of course, the Edward Snowden case, and the ongoing saga of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. There's never been a time when the concept of whistleblowing has been so much in the public mind. So what I want to do today is talk for about 45, 50 minutes about what it's like to be a whistleblower coming out of the intelligence agencies, and then also how the media can be controlled by the intelligence agencies and by government spin machines. So what to watch out for if you go into the media. And then also, if you are a journalist, how you can protect your source or your potential whistleblower in the new surveillance landscape that we are now facing across the planet. So a little bit of sort of spycraft at the end of the talk. But just to start, I need to give you a little bit of history. I'm from the UK, and I worked for the UK Domestic Security Service, which used to be truncated down to UKSS, until one of our German colleagues said that had slightly bad connotations from history. Colloquially, the organisation is called MI5. There's also two other key intelligence agencies in the UK. There's MI6, which is sort of James Bond wannabes. They do the foreign intelligence gathering. And there's also the Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, which is very much in the news at the moment because of Mr. Snowden. And they work very closely with the NSA in the US, hoovering up all our electronic communications. Now, it's interesting. The previous speaker mentioned that the UK has certain whistleblower protection laws. Well, yes, it does. It has something called the Public Interest Disclosure Act, which was passed in 1998. However, this specifically excludes all the intelligence agencies and central government and the military. So all the places you are most likely to see the most heinous state-level crimes, you have no protection if you want to become a whistleblower. In fact, it's worse than that. You have not only no protection, you are specifically lined up to be prosecuted if you become a whistleblower. So how did this come about? In the UK, everything evolves in a very sort of British muddle, historically. We've never had a proper written constitution. We've never had a proper Bill of Rights. What we do have is something, sort of constitutional soup that has evolved over the decades or the centuries. And the intelligence community evolved in the same way. Our intelligence agencies have been around for just over 100 years. They were founded in 1909, and in fact, until 1989, they did not officially exist. So our representatives in Parliament were not allowed to ask what they did. Nobody was allowed to challenge what they got up to. In fact, they could do whatever they wanted in the shadows with no oversight whatsoever. And one very famous whistleblower from the 1980s, a man called Peter Wright, who wrote a best-selling book called Spycatcher, said that in the glory days of the 1970s, they could bug and burgle their way around London with impunity, and they did. However, there were a series of spy scandals in the 1980s, and this meant that come 1989, the government decided to update the law. Up until that point, the only law that was in place was something called the Official Secrets Act 1911, which was there to prosecute traitors, people who gave or sold intelligence information to an enemy power. I mean, we had the Cambridge spy ring, who were giving all our defence secrets and intelligence secrets to the Soviet Union in the 1940s, 50s and 60s. In the 1980s, they updated this law with something called the 1989 Official Secrets Act. And this was put in place not to protect the country's intelligence, not to protect against treachery. We already had that law. It was put in place just to stifle whistleblowers, because we'd had a series of whistleblowers through the 1980s, which meant that if you had or were working for the intelligence agencies or central government or the military, and you spoke to anyone outside your work about what you did, you could be prosecuted for a breach of the OSA and put in prison for 2 years. It also applied to journalists as well. So if you were a journalist covering those sort of disclosures, uniquely in Western Europe, you too could go to prison for doing your job and exposing these crimes. Now, I mentioned the laws, it's a bit dry to start with. Just to give you a little bit of context, that law there was another law in 1989 called the Security Service Act that made MI5 official for the first time, and then MI6 and GCHQ were made official in 1994 with the Intelligence Services Act, which was also crucial because it put in place something in Parliament called the Intelligence and Security Committee, which was supposed to have some sort of oversight into what the spies did, was supposed to hold them to account. Unfortunately, this committee was toothless. They had no powers to do anything more than look at the policy, finance, and administration of the spies. If there were accusations that they were breaking the law, or they were even getting involved in murder plots, they had no power to investigate. Now, I mention this sort of dry legalese because it was in this period that I was recruited to work for MI5. I was actually approached in 1990, and I hadn't wanted to be a spy. I mean, I actually thought the world of spy sounded quite grim. I'd watched things like Tinker Tailor's Soldier Spy by John le Carré with my father and thought, who would want to do that? You'd have to be a complete misfit to go and work for intelligence. Anyway, I applied to be a diplomat. I applied to our Foreign Office and quite fancied the idea of swanning around embassy parties, swilling champagne. Unfortunately, I then got a letter from the Ministry of Defence saying, mysteriously, there may be other jobs you would find more interesting. Now, I opened this letter and I thought, for some reason, I don't know why, my first instinctive response was, oh my God, it's MI5. And I was really frightened. And I couldn't understand why they would be interested in me. And it didn't say anything beyond, if you would like to find out more, please call this number. Now, I was going to ignore it because, as I said, there'd been a whole series of spy scandals in the 1980s, and it sounded like a really grim place to work, so I was going to ignore it. Unfortunately, I opened the letter in the same room when my father was there. And my father, unfortunately, was a spy geek. He was into the John le Carré stuff, and crucially, he was also an investigative journalist. So you can imagine his response, which was, please ring the number, see if you're right, if it's MI5. So forever after, at least I've been able to say to Dad, when he got annoyed about the whistleblowing, look, Dad, it's your fault. It's always good to be able to blame your parents. So I rang the number, and a few months later found myself in an unmarked building in central London being quizzed about my life from the age of 12 onwards by a woman. And this interview went on for about 3 hours. And only halfway through, she said, why do you think you're here? And I said, well, are you MI5? And I felt like a real fool for saying that, because what if it was wrong? But she said, yes, we are. And you have to sign a notification of the Official Secrets Act or this interview terminates. So by that point, I was thoroughly intrigued. I signed. And the interview continued. And then the whole recruitment process continued for months. Now, as I said, this was 1990. They were now legal, apparently, and they told me that they had to obey the law. They had to get ministerial permission to do things which would otherwise deem to be illegal under UK law, such as breaking into our flats and planting bugs, or intercepting our communications, or spying on us. They also said, crucially, that the Cold War was coming to an end, and that they needed a new generation of intelligence officer to work against terrorism targets. And this was a very different area of work. Instead of this sort of slow-paced watching the Russian embassy in London, suddenly you'd be racing around chasing terrorist cells in London, trying to pull together the evidential case to put them on trial. So a very different set of skills. And they reassured me all the way through about 10 months of recruitment that they had to obey the law. And I was very honest all the way through this process. I mean, my ethical views haven't shifted from then to now pretty much. All the long discussions about internment of people without charge in a time of peace, or the use of torture, I was always against all that. And they said at that time, so are we. So I was quite reassured, and eventually after 10 months I was recruited and walked in to their office in January 1991, a long time ago now, to be told that my first posting was not in counter-terrorism, but in fact it was going to be looking at left-wing political subversion, which is precisely the area of work they told me they stopped doing because the Cold War was over. That was the first indication, you might think, that they'd lied to me. Anyway, I spent 2 years in that section, 2 years working against Irish terrorism, and then a final year working in international terrorism. And in my first posting there, I met a man who became my partner and my colleague, called David Shaler, who became the key whistleblower in the late 1990s. And the reason we took that decision was because we worked in all three sections, so the political, the Irish terrorism, and international terrorism. And each time we saw things going wrong. And the mistakes and the crimes got worse and worse. So it was a case almost of, do you know the phrase in English, boiling a frog? Where the water gets hotter and hotter and the amphibian doesn't realise and it boils to death. That's what it felt like inside MI5. So in the counter-subversion section, the first section where we worked, the political side, we were assigned to investigate small left-wing groups, Trotskyist groups, Leninist groups. It was pointless. I mean, there might be 1,000 people in each of these groups. They were not going to be a threat to national security. But it gave us a very historic oversight over what had gone on over the previous decades, where hundreds of MI5 officers have been involved in monitoring their fellow UK citizens for their political activities. I mean, to the extent where you could get a file purely because you were involved in a divorce case with your husband or your wife, and you wrote to MI5 saying, she's a communist, he's a communist, and get each other into trouble. Or there was an even worse example where a schoolboy was doing a project about communism. So he wrote to the Communist Party HQ saying, can you give me some background, please? And because they intercepted the letters going into the HQ, this boy had his letter copied and he got an MI5 file. I mean, you think he'd get an A for effort at least. But it got worse because we were also in that section in 1992, and in the UK we had a general election for Parliament. And at that time, anyone who was standing as a potential Member of Parliament had their names cross-referenced with MI5's records. And if they had a file, that file was pulled out. And then we, the officers in F2, had to summarise what was on that file and write a report that then went to the head of that political party. So, for example, if you then were elected as an MP, but you had a file in MI5, they could assess whether you would be a threat to national security as an MP, or, God forbid, if you got into the cabinet or the government. And at this time, a number of very interesting files came across our desks. They weren't particularly famous then, but they became very famous with the Labour landslide victory in 1997. And pretty much anyone who was anyone during the Labour government from 1997 to 2010 had an MI5 file, anyone who was in cabinet. And we're talking Tony Blair down. Tony Blair, Jack Straw, the former Foreign Secretary, David Blunkett, the former Home Secretary, Peter Mandelson, the Prince of Darkness, as he was always known in the UK press. Everyone who was a cabinet minister had an MI5 file, which they were not allowed to see. And in fact, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary are the key cabinet ministers who are supposed to control MI5 and MI6 and GCHQ. They are their political masters. So you can see the problem in a democracy where the political masters know that secret information is held on them, but they're not allowed to know what it is. So they do the bidding of the spies. It becomes a sort of tail wagging the dog within a democracy. After 2 years there, and we did manage at that time to mainly shut down the investigation of people for their political activity in the UK, after 2 years we worked in the Irish section. I won't go into too much detail about that, but just to say that there were a number of investigations into the provisional IRA, And this was at the height of their bombing campaign on the UK mainland, where bombs would go off on a regular basis on London streets and people would die. And we saw a number of cases where the bombings should and could have been prevented. And then the mistakes were covered up by MI5, and they lied about them to government to hide their mistakes. And government always says, we know what the spies do. They don't. It's very easy for the spies to lie about what they do. But it was in the last section where we were working in the international terrorism branch that we saw the cases that made us decide to resign and then to go public and blow the whistle. Now, the first one was an illegal phone tap against a high-profile left-wing journalist called Victoria Britton, who worked as the deputy foreign editor of The Guardian newspaper. And she was involved in a libel case where she was holding funds for the person who was the defendant in the case, a Nigerian called Tojo Tisikata. And he had links to the Libyan regime, which, of course, was of high interest to MI5 at the time. So MI5 got terribly excited about this and thought she was money laundering or an agent of the Libyan regime or something. And they immediately put a telephone tap on her telephone lines. In fact, if they just read her articles in the Guardian newspaper, they would have seen she was helping this man in his libel case. This operation was illegal under the terms of the various laws that were brought in the 1980s. And yet, MI5 did not care that they were breaking the law for months and months. And they also spent about £750,000 illegally investigating this woman. The two other cases in this section, G branch it was called, international terrorism. First of all, there was the bombing of the Israeli embassy in London in 1994. And this was a car bomb that was driven up and parked outside the Israeli embassy in Kensington Palace Gardens. And it exploded. And nobody knew where it had come from, who could be involved, because MI5's assessment had always been that while many people might want to take action against the Israelis in London, no terrorist group had the capability to do it. So they had always said that the threat to Israeli interests was moderate. So this explosion happened, and the Metropolitan Police, Secret Police, the special branch, rounded up a whole range of Palestinian students based in London, and eventually charged and then put on trial and convicted 2 Palestinian students of conspiring to cause this attack. They could not charge them for doing the attack because they had cast-iron alibis on the day. However, MI5, which had gathered not only all the police evidence, but also all the intelligence, the secret information around this case, in its official assessment by the lead intelligence officer, his view was that Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, had carried out a controlled explosion outside its embassy in London. Now, if you read that on the internet, you think, crazy, crazy conspiracy theory. This was the assessment of the lead investigating officer in MI5, whose code number was G91. And his view was that it had been done for 2 reasons. First of all, because the Israelis for years had been hassling for increased security protection around their interests in London. And MI5 had said the threat is moderate. They wouldn't give them extra protection. By letting off a controlled explosion in which nobody was killed, that, of course, immediately gave them greater protection. But the key assessment was that there was a growing Palestinian support network, political support network in London, of which these 2 Palestinian students were key members. And, of course, by arresting them and charging them and convicting them, the whole network shattered and never quite rebuilt. So that would have achieved 2 objectives by Mossad. These 2 youngsters were convicted, even though MI5 knew they were innocent, and they both got 20 years in prison each. They were only released a few years ago, and the young woman called Sama Alami had a nervous breakdown, understandably, in prison. But the case that made us quit, this was the reason why we resigned and why we blew the whistle, was what became known in the media as the Gaddafi plot. And this seems quite quaint now, after what we've seen going on in the Middle East over the last 10 years. But in the 1990s, Libya was a priority 1 target for Western intelligence. Gaddafi was a brutal dictator to the people who stood up against him in Libya, no doubt about it. Gaddafi saw himself as a revolutionary and had funded what he saw as other revolutionary terrorist groups across the planet, including the IRA, no doubt about it. But what MI6 got involved in 1995 and 1996, broke all domestic and international law. Now, at this point, David Shaler was the head of the Libyan section in MI5. And normally MI6 and MI5 don't like each other. They compete behind the scenes and fight behind the scenes. They don't tend to talk too much. But in this case, he and his counterpart, whose code number was PT16B, I think, not quite 007, but it's getting there, he briefed David and the rest of his staff officially about an unfolding plot. And in a nutshell, this was a volunteer from the Libyan Military Intelligence Agency who walked into the British Embassy in Tunis in 1995 and said, "I'd like to speak to the local spy, please." MI6 always works in embassies. It's very easy to find them. And he spoke to the spy and said, "Well, we have this ragtag group of Islamic extremists in Libya who want to try and overthrow Colonel Gaddafi. However, we need help. Primarily, we need financial help in order to buy the equipment to do this." And with very few checks, MI6 went along with this and gave this guy, who became codenamed Tumworth, in the region of $100,000 to $120,000 over a few months to actually try and plan and effect this coup. Now, David was concerned about this and raised it with his bosses, but in MI5 there was very much a sort of culture of don't rock the boat, keep your head down, do what you're told, and nobody took him seriously. In fact, even David, I didn't think, took it that seriously to begin with, because MI6 was always coming up with these James Bond schemes and often didn't go ahead and do anything. However, in early 1996, a number of intelligence reports came across his desk, which showed that indeed an attack had gone ahead. And what had happened was that Gaddafi had been in Sirte in Libya at the Libyan People's Congress and was driving back to Tripoli in a cavalcade of cars, and an explosion had gone off under one of the cars. Manifestly, it was the wrong one at that point, because Gaddafi survived to be assassinated 2 years ago. But innocent people were killed in that car, and innocent people were killed in the ensuing security shootout. In fact, I think the total number of deaths that day was 11. So what we had here was not only a highly reckless MI6-funded operation in a very volatile part of the world, which could have destabilised the whole area, but it actually turned out to be illegal under UK law. Going back to the 1994 Intelligence Services Act, which governed MI6, they were indeed allowed to carry out illegal operations abroad if they had their political master's prior written permission, the Foreign Secretary. In this case, they didn't. So they broke all laws, and they failed in what they did, and innocent people died. So this is 1996. At this point, we're thinking we don't really want to be part of an intelligence community that is involved in what is effectively state-sponsored terrorism. If you think about it, Britain was funding Al-Qaeda in Libya in an illegal operation that kills innocent people. How much more heinous can you get? And bear in mind as well, the intelligence agencies in the UK knew that Al-Qaeda, or however you want to define it, was the new big emerging threat. MI5 had just started investigating them. So you have MI5 investigating them, MI6 funding them. Remind you of Syria today, perhaps? Anyway, so this is why we resigned. And what to do under UK law? Because, as I mentioned at the start, there is the Official Secrets Act, which makes it a crime to speak to anyone outside your agency about crimes committed by the agency. So you can imagine how far those complaints ever get. It's even outside the law to go to your local MP. Now, crucially, David had been a journalist on the Sunday Times before he became a spy, so he sort of knew how the old British media worked. So his calculation was to resign, make contact with the media, and to go public and create as much of a scandal as possible so that the media would push for an inquiry into the crimes of the spies and perhaps potentially have a reform of some of the laws that governed them. So this was the risk he took. So in 1996, before we resigned, he made contact with some local journalists, one on the Mail on Sunday. The story did not break until 1997 because, of course, there was mutual distrust. David was terrified that the journalist would shop him to MI5, and the journalist thought it might be some sort of spy sting story to try and set him up. So it was this really tortuous, slow courtship between the two. And in fact, for months, the journalist only knew David as Mike from MI5 for some reason. He chose that as his false name. But eventually the story did break, and that was in August 1997. And we went on the run. we did an Edward Snowden. In fact, I think he's the only subsequent whistleblower I've ever heard of who's preemptively gone on the run before the story appears in the world's news. So I feel quite sort of maternal looking at his case, actually. So we did a flit. We fled to the Netherlands, and then we had a month literally on the run around Europe, trying to stay one step ahead of the spies and the police who were on our tail. And the story went huge. It was a big, big scandal. And the government injuncted David Shayler as a person. They took out an injunction against the entire British media as well, within the first week of the story. And after 1 week, by that time, we made it all the way down to the far southwest of France. And we thought, this is great. OK, we're on the run. OK, they want to prosecute us, but the media is behind us. Thank you. Now they will fight for an inquiry, which is precisely what we had calculated. We went to bed that night in Bayonne, lovely city, if you ever get the chance to go down there, and slept for about the first time in 9 months because we'd been so stressed by the whole process. Only to wake up the next morning to discover that Princess Diana had died in Paris that night. So you can imagine, that was the end of any media coverage. No inquiry, no pushback, no nothing. And, you know, what can you do? You can't factor that into your whistleblowing plans. In fact, I did wonder when Snowden first went, no, this is a bit dark, when Snowden first went public, Nelson Mandela almost died. And I was thinking, I wonder if they're just waiting to pull the plug. Dark, sorry. So we had a month on the run, literally. And I have to say that was actually much more being like James Bond than working for the agency. At least we knew how to keep hidden. After that, or during that time, the injunction was taken out. And then we also heard that our flat had been invaded by the British secret police and ripped apart in a counter-terrorism-style search. And when I say that, I mean they pulled the carpets up, they pulled the floorboards up, they ripped our bath apart, they took the pipes down, they smashed furniture, everything. Now, what the hell they thought they were going to find, I do not know. But they didn't find anything. They did have fun in my underwear drawer, which was a bit distressing, and they took away a lot of our personal belongings. Anyway, after a month, I decided to return to the UK, partly to clear up our smashed flat, partly to deal with our traumatised families who'd had no warning at all that we were about to go public and go on the run, because we thought our telephones were bugged, our flat was bugged, we were very, very security conscious. So the first that our poor family saw of the story was the newspaper front pages. And they were obviously traumatised by the whole thing. And I also had to go back and, of course, deal with all our lawyers. Now, I hadn't really done anything at that point, apart from be David Shayler's girlfriend. That didn't stop. And I went back telling the police I would turn myself in, be arrested, be questioned. I flew back with my lawyer, who was the head of the UK Civil Liberties Union, Liberty. And I was still grabbed at the immigration desk at Gatwick Airport. So again, watching what happened to David Miranda, Glenn Greenwald's partner, who got caught under counter-terrorism laws at Heathrow Airport recently, it sort of brought back quite a lot of memories. Anyway, I was never charged with anything. I was taken to a counter-terrorism suite and questioned for about 6 hours. They never charged me, but they kept me on police bail, which meant I had to go back to the UK for 6 months to answer that bail condition. It got worse, though, because the next day, in coordinated raids at 7 a.m., they then arrested David Shayler's brother and his 2 best friends on trumped-up charges. They never charged them with anything. They were never prosecuted. It was all a way of controlling the whistleblower, putting pressure on their family so that they would behave, not bring out more stories. After that, I went back and joined David in France. We had 10 months living in hiding in a very primitive French farmhouse where we tried to negotiate with the government and say, we have some very serious allegations we still want to bring out. Because up to that point, the newspaper had only reported the lower level stories, things like the files on government ministers, the illegal phone tap. They were too craven to go with the Libyan story, the Gaddafi assassination plot up front. They wanted to investigate it more themselves. So for those 10 months, investigations were done. And eventually, in July 1998, finally the newspapers broke the Gaddafi story. The Sunday Times, the Mail on Sunday, and also the BBC Panorama programme did a special investigation into it. And miraculously, after 10 months of letting us rot abroad, the British government swung into action and issued an urgent extradition request to the French government, saying that David Shayler was an enemy agent giving secrets to an enemy power. He was a traitor. Please arrest him and extradite him. Now, under international law, the French had to do that, and they picked him up off a Paris street, and he disappeared into the French legal system. Even his lawyer couldn't find him for, I think, 72 hours. I didn't see him for over 2 months, and he was imprisoned for almost 4 months in Paris. Then, of course, the British government finally gave the paperwork across to the French, and they realised what they had. It was a man who was a whistleblower. He was not some traitor giving secrets to an enemy power. He was a whistleblower, pure and simple. And the French have a specific law which says, if you are a whistleblower, your potential offence is political, and they do not extradite for political offences. So I think any potential whistleblowers in this audience, I think that law still stands. So if you need to go on the run, go to France. Anyway, he was released, so thank you to France. We then moved to Paris for 2 years, lived more openly, continued to campaign. The Gaddafi story was out. The Israeli embassy story came out. And also other information emerged. There was a leaked document from MI6 establishing that the Gaddafi plot story was indeed true. And yet the British government continued to deny it. We also saw other cases as well of people being arrested and tried around this case, journalists, for example. So it became very messy. And also one of our former colleagues from MI5 decided to come out in our support because he hated what was going on in the British media, where it was just trying to attack the character of the whistleblower and ignore the content of his disclosures. And this is a classical tactic when you deal with whistleblowers of any description. So play the man. So one of our colleagues came out as well, very bravely, and said, I agree with what they're saying. I understand what they're saying. I completely support what they're saying. But the media was spun that day very cleverly. This was going to be the front page news story in the British media. The day before, the memoirs of the former head of MI5, Dame Stella Rimington, were somehow leaked by the government to the same newspaper, and that became the big newspaper story about spies that day. So the support disappeared. So the manipulation of the press became more and more apparent. Anyway, to cut a long story short, in 2000, David decided to go back to the UK to stand trial. He knew he'd have to face trial for a breach of the Official Secrets Act. He went back and expected to be put on trial relatively quickly, within 6 months, because he was only ever charged with the very low-level early disclosures. He was never charged with the Gaddafi plot disclosures. Despite that, there was a whole series of pre-trial hearings that went on for over 2 years, so that when he eventually got up in front of a jury of his peers, he had been so hemmed in by pre-trial rulings, he was not allowed to even breathe the word Gaddafi plot, otherwise he would have been convicted of contempt of court. He was not allowed to say why he'd done what he'd done. In fact, he wasn't even allowed to question his accusers freely. So, for example, there are a number of prosecution witnesses brought to the court, and he wanted to cross-examine them. And he had to submit his questions for vetting to the judge and the prosecuting lawyer before he was allowed to ask the questions. And, of course, they crossed them all out. So it was a bit of a kangaroo court, and inevitably he was convicted. He was facing 6 years in prison, but mitigation pleas and things reduced it to 6 months, thank God. So not quite the 30 years or the 35 years that Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden face. So that was the story. I think it was bad enough to go through the court cases. It was bad enough to watch my partner, my former partner, going through a trial and being convicted. But one of the most damaging aspects of this was the media response to the whistleblower. And this got me thinking about how the spies in the government can exercise control to a certain degree over the media, our free media in the UK. So, for example, at the end of David's trial, during the formal ruling from the judge said that he accepted that David Shayler had done what he'd done in the public interest, that there had been no financial motivation, and that no lives had ever been put at risk during his whistleblowing. And all the journalists were there, sitting opposite me, writing this down. So imagine my surprise. The next day, I look at the newspapers, and all the headlines say, Shayler sells agent lives down the river for money. It's like, hang on, was I in the same courtroom? And that got me thinking, how is this power, this leverage, exercised against what is supposed to be one of the world's freest media? So I've been doing a lot of research, and a lot of stories from journalists. Many of my best friends are journalists, and it's quite a murky world to delve into. And this started by listening to some of the stories I heard from the journalists that had actually been involved in our case. Most notably, the editor of the newspaper that originally broke the story was a man called Jonathan Holborough. And he was a journalist of the old school, a real, campaigning, investigative, hardcore journalist who really went for this story. And immediately after the first news broke, way back in 1997, he told us that he was summoned to number 10 Downing Street by Tony Blair and his spin doctor, notorious spin doctor, a brutish man called Alistair Campbell. And he went to Downing Street to talk to Blair. And interestingly, Blair dragged him out into the back garden of Downing Street and very worriedly kept saying, "What else does Shayla know? What else does Shayla know?" So it was almost like even Tony Blair did not trust his officers not to be bugged by MI5. And that was the conclusion that Jonathan Holborough drew, which is interesting if you're the Prime Minister of the UK. There are other issues as well. One of the journalists involved was a very good investigative guy called Martin Bright, who was the Home Affairs correspondent for the Observer newspaper. And he did some fantastic stories and some fantastic investigations around the backgrounds to the Gaddafi plot and the Israeli embassy too and all the rest of it. And he was arrested by the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, hauled out of his offices. The heavies threatened to go into the Observer newspaper and take all their computers and seize all the journalists' notes to try and get any information they might have received from David Shayla. And in fact, it looked like Martin Bright was going to be hung out to dry by his newspaper until the National Union of Journalists stepped in and started campaigning around him. But he was quite brutalised by the whole process. Worse, though, was the editor of a bi-weekly magazine called Punch, very famous, now defunct, which did hard-hitting investigative journalism, a man called James Steen, who in 2000 went ahead and published a story, one of the Irish IRA terrorism stories, about the bombing of Bishopsgate in the City of London in 1993, which had gone wrong and innocent people died, and then the government lied, the MI5 lied to the government. And he and David wrote a very careful piece about this story, exposing the problems and what went wrong. And Steen then submitted it to the government under the terms of the injunction, saying, "I would like to publish this story. Is there anything that needs to be taken out?" And the government lawyers refused and refused and refused and refused for weeks to come back to him. Eventually, in frustration, he said, "This is my printing deadline. I'm going to print it. Publish and be damned." And he did. And then the government lawyers came back to him with their redactions. The key thing being that apparently it was illegal to say that a terrorist suspect had gone on the run to Ireland. What James Steen should have printed was a terrorist suspect had gone over to Ireland. Now, I can't see the distinction particularly myself, but anyway. For that, James Steen was convicted of a breach of the injunction, and he was convicted of contempt of court and got a sentence, lost his job, everything. But the worst one, and this particularly for student journalists, I think, is perhaps most resonant, was a case in 2000 again, where there was a young woman called Julianne Davis, a student at Kingston University in London, who edited her university newspaper. And she had the oomph to email David then and say, "Can I come to Paris and interview you? It's an interesting story." So she came over to Paris, they had a nice lunch, she went back, wrote her story, that was that. About a week later, she was sitting in her lecture theatre like this, and Special Branch Metropolitan Police officers came in and hauled her out of the lecture theatre and arrested her under the 1911 Official Secrets Act, which is there for treachery. She's a student journalist. Now, they took all her computers, all her belongings, everything. She was never charged, and she sued the Met for wrongful arrest, of course, and won. But her life was turned upside down and inside out. She lost her place at university. She then went and retrained and became a very good journalist, strangely enough. But the sheer power of intimidation that can be used, even against a student, to try and stifle whistleblowers is quite something. Anyway, so these were the stories that were sort of swilling around during our whistleblowing years. The case officially ended in 2003. David had served his sentence, paid his debt to society. We wrote a book, which was then stifled by the government for about 18 months and eventually came out. And sadly, we separated in 2006. The whole stress and strain of the process was quite incredible over those years. But as I said, it intrigued me how the government and the intelligence agencies can control what is supposed to be the fourth estate, a free media. So I've been doing a lot of digging since then. I know a lot of journalists. I've heard a lot of stories. So I just want to lay out a few thoughts from my experiences in the UK. And this is a country where they exercise soft power and hard power equally, I think, against the media. And the soft power, the carrot and the stick, the soft power is actually rather seductive for journalists. It starts off with, you are a journalist on a newspaper, you want stories. You might know someone you were at university with who then asks you out for lunch, who happens to be working for the government somewhere, but you don't know where. Then they say, well, old boy, we might be able to give you some leads for stories. Would you like to take this story? And it might be about MI5 or MI6 or the military or whatever. And you do, and you write it up. And thereby, you can become dependent on getting those stories from that source. If you start to question the stories or investigate them and challenge them, you stop getting the source of your information. So you become quite dependent on getting those briefings in order to get your headlines, in order to keep your job. It can get worse, though, because the next stage, and I know people this has happened to, is that rather than just passively receiving these stories, you are then expected to actively report back to your handler in the spy agencies. You become what's known as an agent of influence within your media room. And this has happened, where if your media organisation is preparing a story which is potentially damaging to the spies or the military or the government, you are expected to report back and give them due warning that this story is being prepared. And then, of course, all your colleagues don't know who might be reporting back, and it fosters distrust within your media room. In fact, there was a very brave man called David Rose who came out a few years ago in the UK saying, mea culpa, I did this exactly in this way, where I was approached by a university friend who then inducted me into this, and then I became an agent of influence. But then he outed himself after 10 years of doing this because he could not, with clear conscience, continue doing that as a journalist. I have to say, I haven't seen too many of his bylines since he outed himself, but I hope he's okay. In fact, I had dinner with a very grand old man of Fleet Street a few months ago now, a while ago now, very famous journalist who broke some of the major news stories throughout the 70s and 80s in the UK. And I was discussing this sort of mechanism, and he said, well, of course, my dear, we all knew who the agents of influence were in our newsroom. There were at least two. We always knew who they were, so we just were clever around them. So it's not just me being paranoid that comes from the horse's mouth. But it also goes up levels because you get the sort of charm offensive where you get senior journalists and editors invited to have cosy lunches with the heads of the spy agencies. Or you have the proprietors of major news organisations or senior editors in those news organisations meeting senior spies or meeting senior politicians. And this, of course, has all been laid bare with the phone hacking scandal in the UK. The links between the Murdoch press, our Prime Minister, various other high-level officials, has laid bare the fact that this sort of backroom deals and compromises are endemic within, at all levels, of the media and the spies and the government and the police even. So it's quite corrupt, and it's very easy, for example, for an editor to be invited in to have lunch with the head of MI5 or 6, and there's a story that the editor is broken, and the spy says, well, it's just fantasy, it's a conspiracy theory, don't take this person too seriously, they're too junior, or they're disgruntled, or they were sacked, or all the standard lies are trotted out. And that's how stories can be suppressed. That's soft power. The hard power in the UK is a raft of laws that can be used against journalists. And I have to say, I think the UK intelligence agencies are the least accountable and most legally protected in any Western notional democracy. Sure, we have a Whistleblower Protection Act in the UK, but as I said at the start, that only covers other whistleblowers. Intelligence is specifically excluded from that, as they are specifically excluded from freedom of information laws as well. So what can they use in the UK? Well, we have, where shall I start? There's a long list. We have injunctions, where stories can be banned, which were taken out against David and the UK media. Over the last few years, we have super injunctions, where the newspaper or the media organisation cannot even mention there's an injunction in place. The government has the same thing. They're called public interest immunity certificates. So that's a government injunction. And they can have government super PIIs too. So, for example, during David Shayler's case, his trial, which went on for 6 weeks, for that 6 weeks period, the entire newspaper and media of the UK was not allowed to mention the Gaddafi plot, just in case it appeared in a newspaper and might influence the jury, because it wasn't allowed to be mentioned during the trial. So even though this story had been all over the UK media and internationally as well for years, for that 6 weeks period, that story disappeared from the public record. And that was a government super injunction. Terrorism laws are now being used increasingly against journalists in the UK, where they are being forced or threatened to hand over their notes and their sources to the secret police, because they say, your source is a potential terrorist, trust us. Journalists, thank God, tend to resist this, even in the face of going to prison. And in fact, we're seeing the same thing happening in the US now as well. Case of Rosen, James Rosen, who I think is being threatened with prison for not disclosing a CIA source at the moment. So we have the Terrorism Act, and this, of course, was the same act that was used to intersect David Miranda, Glenn Greenwald's partner, as he travelled from Berlin back to Rio via London Heathrow. Glenn Greenwald famously is the journalist who's been breaking the Edward Snowden stories, and Miranda, his partner, was just held for 9 hours and then released, but had all his computers, his USB sticks, his telephones, everything were confiscated and to this day not given back to him. What else do we have? One of the other great things in the UK, and it could only happen in the UK, it's very British, is something called the Defence Press Advisory Board, or Committee, otherwise known as the D-Notice Committee. And this is a sense of voluntary self-censorship by the media. So you have a D-Notice Committee, which has all the senior spies on it, and military people and government, and all the senior great and the good from our media going along. And if a contentious story comes up, they will self-censor and put a D-notice on the story, which is not legally enforceable, but they expect the media to honour by not publishing that story. So it's media self-censorship. And indeed, it emerged that recently The Guardian was put under a D-notice committee with the unfolding Edward Snowden stories. Within a week or two of them first appearing, a D-notice was slapped on The Guardian. So it's still being used. Of course, we also have, most invidiously, the Official Secrets Act, which doesn't just persecute the whistleblower, it also persecutes the journalists who cover the whistleblower's stories. Under the Official Secrets Act, the whistleblower can be prosecuted under Section 1.1 and go to prison for up to 2 years per charge. And they don't have to prove damage. There is no public interest defence. All they have to prove is that you worked for the intelligence agency and you spoke to someone outside the intelligence agency. Now, with journalists, it's slightly better. Under Section 1.5, if a journalist covers a story, they have to prove that story caused damage to national security. However, that is a very nebulous and legally undefined term in the UK, and it can be used to cover government embarrassment, lies, mistakes, whatever. So that is something which is unique, I think, in the UK. Even in Russia, if you publish a story by a whistleblower, sure, the whistleblower will go to prison, but the journalists are specifically protected. So it sort of puts in sharp relief quite how draconian the UK laws are around official secrecy. So there's a whole raft of things they can do to control the media. So I just want to finish, the final section of my talk is looking at, as a journalist, what can you do? If you get that fateful phone call from Mike from MI5 or whoever, how do you go about getting a story published to provide maximum effect? How do you even attract the whistleblower to start with? And how do you protect them in this era of endemic electronic surveillance? Because we're all spied on now. You know, hundreds of American journalists, as has been revealed, were spied on in AP and Fox News and everything. It is very, very difficult to keep your source secure, particularly if your source is coming out of intelligence or the military or central government, because they're the ones where the pushback from central government and intelligence will be the heaviest, where you'll be up against a nation-state level infrastructure. How do you protect your source as a journalist? Well, it's difficult. You get the first phone call. Well, first of all, how do you get that first phone call, I think, is the key question. And particularly in this age of WikiLeaks and other organisations like that. Because I have to say, you know, now, if I were a whistleblower, a potential whistleblower, sitting behind my desk in MI5, an organisation like WikiLeaks would be incredibly attractive. Because you retain a certain degree of control, at least in the initial stages. You would give your documents securely, anonymously, to an organisation that could then publish them, which means that your documents will never be lost. It's not like you hand them over to a newspaper, which then has to hand them back to the government when legal forces come into action and you lose your proof. You give them something like WikiLeaks and your proof is safe. They will then publish anonymously. You still have control over whether you are a leaker or whether you want to go public and become a whistleblower and argue the case. So that would be very attractive. So what can old-school journalism offer in order to attract the whistleblowers? Well, I've been saying for years, actually, the best way to attract a whistleblower is to have the right profile. If you write regularly about intelligence or military issues or defence issues or whatever, with the right attitude, and you have fire in your belly, and you fight for the causes you believe in, a whistleblower will find you. And in fact, that's precisely what we've seen recently with how Edward Snowden identified Glenn Greenwald. Because Greenwald had this track record over a decade. He was a lawyer, he's an activist, he's a journalist, he writes intelligently about all these issues, and that's why Snowden reportedly went to him. So if you can build up that track record, that profile, the whistleblowers will find you. They research who they're going to work with. They want someone who has the clout and the fight to actually stand up against the bullies. So that's the first step. Then you get the fateful phone call. Hey, it's Mike from MI5. And you go, oh, shit. Now what do? You get off the phone as quickly as possible. You say, meet me here. And you take 2 Virgin pay-as-you-go mobile phones, or even, if necessary, 2 Virgin bought in cash from a shop, little notebook computers, and you plumb in the communication details to each one and only use that between yourselves, never to anyone else. There is no track record of any other sort of communications. You meet in cheap or mid-level hotel rooms. They're usually the best because you can pay by cash. There is no electronic trail when you book the hotel room. At each meeting, you have already planned where your next meeting will be. So you say that and you meet in a different place, but there's no electronic trail again. It's very old school. I mean, you know, if you really want to see how to do this, read Len Dayton or John le Carre. It's old school spying. Interestingly, I read recently that the Kremlin has gone back to using typewriters for its really top secret documents because they don't trust computers. And so that's how we have to think these days. So plan it as if you are running a spy. You know, well, you are running a spy, and you need to protect them. You need to take their security seriously because they will be. They know what they're up against. They know the volume and scale of the potential pushback, electronic surveillance, human surveillance following you around, bugs, that sort of thing. Always be aware of the law of your own country as well. So, for example, in the UK, if you speak over telephone communications, that conversation, even if it's recorded, cannot be used in a court of law as evidence against you. Of course, it gives away what you're planning, so you're giving away the intelligence, but it's not evidential. However, if there is a property bug in your computer next to you where you're on the phone, or in your home when you're on the phone, that property bug will pick up your end of the conversation at least, and in the UK that can be used as evidence against you. So you just need to be aware of what the laws are specifically around surveillance in your own country to protect both yourself, your story, and your source. Of course, never meet them in your own home, never meet them in their home, never ever meet in one of your cars, because cars are so easy to bug. Even if you meet in a park and do the old, spy stuff, be aware that they can still get you from hundreds of meters away. So this is why cheap, anonymous, pay-as-you-go hotel rooms can be the best place to meet. It can look a bit seedy, but, hey, it's better than being in prison. So all these things you need to think about. And if you have a high-level, a high-grade whistleblower coming out of a serious organisation, you need to be seen to be taking this sort of thing seriously. And if they suggest other things to do, because they're the intelligence expert, listen to them and do it, because they know probably more than you will about exactly what the surveillance capabilities will be. And it's important to do that, to build up that trust. It can take months, like it did in the David Shaler newspaper case, to build up that trust so that you can work freely together and get the story out there. But the other additional thing you can do now in this post-WikiLeaks era is provide a humane, pastoral care type element as a journalist, because the whistleblower is ruining their career, they're breaking their career by speaking out. That's it. They will never get a proper job again. They will be blacklisted. They may well end up imprisoned. They will certainly lose most of their friends, their social life, their means of income, the means to pay their mortgage. They'll probably lose their relationship too, their family possibly. So it's a huge step to take, whereas, of course, you as the journalist will be making your career. And I have seen many, many cases where journalists come in quite predatorily and asset strip the whistleblower and run and get the story, and then that's it. And the whistleblower is just left high and dry. I mean, in our case, we were lucky enough, there were a few honourable exceptions who did protect and fight for us, both the lawyers and the journalists. And they were invaluable, and they kept us going. And because of that, actually, they built up that profile, which meant other whistleblowers went to them afterwards. So it was a sort of self-perpetuating cycle. So yes, be aware of that. And aftercare as well. Once you get the story, you get a big scandal, you get more stories coming out of it, there'll probably be a prosecution, a court case. And then what? What's the whistleblower going to do? Do you keep fighting for these sort of issues? Do you keep pushing for inquiries? Do you keep pushing the government to try and change the laws? And that's important. You need to have that sort of sense of humanity and also social values about why you're doing this, why it's important to get these stories out, and what the potential impact can be. And I think we've seen very clearly with Glenn Greenwald what he's been doing and how he's been doing it. That's become very clear. And he definitely seems to have the fight in his belly to carry on with that fight. So there's a whole range of things to consider if you get your whistleblower coming to you. One thing I would suggest as well is many of us are very used to consuming computer programs, but you need to think a little bit more about the actual tech security around it. And if it's something you're not a specialist in, there are many organisations that can indeed help. And in fact, there are even these sort of civil society organisations like crypto parties. I don't know if any of you have heard of these or been to one, where a bunch of geeks will volunteer their time, you take your laptop along, and they will help you learn how to do basic tech security. I mean, these are cropping up in cities across the world now because suddenly everyone is very aware that they need to ensure their own privacy because they can't rely on the government to preserve their basic right to privacy. So crypto parties, you take your laptop along. Key things I would suggest is if you're going to use ghastly things like Gmail or Hotmail or whatever, which anything that goes through the states, of course, is hoovered up. Pretty much anything is hoovered up anyway. But if you're going to use emails like that, encrypt them. And don't use commercial encryption. Use OpenPGP. That's the one thing that seems to be fairly trusted, even by the uber geeks. Be aware that if you're using anything in the States, it will be intercepted and stored and can be used against you. If you want to use really private stuff, then I would suggest getting something that runs through Switzerland. Norway's pretty good, or Iceland, but Switzerland seems to be the place. In fact, my website's based there now, which is great. So is my email. Also, if you go to a meeting with your source, don't take your normal mobile phone. You might as well be taking a tracker device with you, which can then also record what is going on around you. And if you think this is fanciful, they just drop software into it remotely, and it will act as a recording device. And if they really want you, even if you switch off your phone and take the battery out, there might be an extra little battery in there to keep it going for an extra 15 minutes. because you think those crucial 15 minutes you can talk freely. Great. Apart from you can't. And I know this happens because just before I left the UK 4 years ago or whatever, my mobile phone started playing up. And people could indeed, when they rang in, hear what was going on around the phone before anyone answered. It became a recording device. Something malfunctioned, and I realised that was what was going on. And you just get to a point where, you know, Christ, they must have better things to listen to. Anyway. So, yes, as responsible journalists, if you're handling intelligence whistleblowers particularly, be aware that the pushback will be at least state level. And the more effective the whistleblower, the more heavy-hitting the stories, the more the pushback will be. As we have seen particularly with the WikiLeaks saga, I mean, WikiLeaks is a publisher, it's not a source. WikiLeaks is a publisher, but the pushback has been global. It's been unprecedented, not just legally, but also financially. You know, all these sort of illegal blockages of donations and things, all the illegal takedowns of the websites. In fact, the only country that didn't take down the WikiLeaks website when the pushback started was indeed Switzerland, which is how we all know it's a good place to be. So if you have a really good whistleblower, you will get this degree of pushback. You have to be prepared for it, and you have to take their security seriously. And you have to protect them before, during, and I would suggest after, as a humane deed, but also because it will be good for your longer-term career. Just to finish, I would say I've never seen a time where we've needed whistleblowers more. I mentioned the Gaddafi plot from 1996. What happened 2 years ago was almost like a replay of it. You know, this narrative in the newspapers about rebel insurgents, you know, fighting the evil dictator. And yet it turned out that it was the CIA and MI6 on the ground funding the very same groups they had funded in 1996 to get rid of Gaddafi. And that time they succeeded. Brutally. Dragging him out of that pipe and raping him with a bayonet and beating him up and murdering him. And this was done in 2011 in the full glare of the world's media. This was done as humanitarian intervention. So think of the moral journey we've made from 1996, where it was done secretly, had to be kept ultra secret because it was so shameful, and yet only 15 years later they could do it openly, flagrantly, and just break whatever laws. Now, what does that say about our countries, our democracies, and the upholding of international law? I think it's disgraceful. And we're seeing the same again in Syria. And thank God, the pushback, the public opinion is making it more difficult for them to do what they did in Iraq and Libya. And nobody I've met for months now seems to believe the fairy tale about WMD. I mean, we've been there a million times with so many other countries that at least we're not falling for it again. But with that, and with the failure of the banking system, so many other scandals, you know, in the UK, the health service, we have never had greater need for whistleblowers and greater need for transparency, because it's only with transparency and accountability we have the information to be, one, good citizens, informed citizens, but also push for justice. So I would say that now is the time of the whistleblowers. If Edward Snowden can survive this process, and I think he has a good chance, touch wood, if he can, rather than be crushed by it, it'll be an encouragement to all other whistleblowers. There must be many sitting behind their desk potentially thinking, shall I do it or shall I not? If one whistleblower can be seen to survive and thrive and build a new life, that will help others have the courage to come forth. The other thing that will help, of course, is good campaigning journalists. So please go forth and write. Thank you very much.
We need to, as we are taping it, we need to get your questions in the microphone. Anders has one over there. I have one over here. And who wants to start? You want to start. So you will start.
Apparently. The question I wanted to ask is how to increase the public opinion that whistleblowers are doing a good thing, because mostly the older part of the generations, they think they are expressing the secret information, doing bad things, and they think that state surveillance actually protects them. So how to sway the public opinion that if the state breaks the law, it's still breaking the law?
Very good question. The old view is that if you expose things, I mean, particularly in America where you swear an oath or whatever to the service, then you are a snitch or a traitor for exposing things. But I think there have been so many cases now, particularly in America, with the war on whistleblowers, which Obama has been waging. I mean, he's now tried to prosecute 7 intelligence agency whistleblowers since he's become president, which is more than all the aggregate number of whistleblowers prosecuted under the Espionage Act 1917 since 1917. So he's waging a war on whistleblowers. And I think the more it is seen that these people are coming out and exposing criminality on the part of the spies, they are breaking the Constitution of America, which they have sworn to uphold. And also, particularly in Snowden's case, it has a global reach where suddenly it's not just Americans who are first-tier human beings, apparently protected by the shreds of the Constitution, but all the rest of us who are second-tier human beings who can be spied on with impunity globally and taken out by drone strikes or whatever. I think it's becoming clearer over the last decade because of the brutish response to the war on terror that there is an increasing need for people to come forth. Ideally, I mean, people have asked me this before, ideally in the UK, people would not have to blow the whistle. They should have an avenue they could go to legally, but that is effective legally as well. So, for example, in Parliament, there's something called the Intelligence and Security Committee, as I mentioned during my talk, which can only look at policy, finance, administration, or could for most of its existence. This year, it is now allowed to question people about operational issues. But it is still very establishment, and there are no legal requirements, and people can't be prosecuted by it. So if, for example, there was a proper intelligence committee that whistleblowers could go to with confidence that their disclosures would be properly investigated and justice would be done if necessary, I think that would make it better all round. But until that happens, whistleblowers will continue to come out. You know, potentially whistleblowers can be very good for organisations. You can expose wrongdoing, malpractice, cover-ups, not just within the intelligence agencies, within the banking sector or health or wherever, which then can improve the operational capability of that organisation, but also improves people's trust in the probity of that organisation. So it can be win-win if the whistleblowers are treated correctly. But going after them and trying to put them in prison for 35 years or something is just disproportionate. And I think that the more this happens, the more obvious it's going to be to people that whistleblowers are not actually bad because they are risking so much to expose these crimes. And there's little to be gained from it, apart from exploding their whole lives. I think any thinking people will see that that's the case. You know, it's a sort of lose-lose for the whistleblower, but potentially a win-win for the community that they serve. Edward Snowden said very clearly he'd be willing to die for his country. He wants to fight for the old values of the Constitution, and that's why he's done what he's done.
You want to add to that? Inga? Ines, you want to add to that?
Before you said what you said in the end, I was also thinking that the way the power, the legal bodies, legislation is saying what is good and bad is so influential. Mm-hmm. So if there are these avenues, as you say, if there is a legal protection to whistleblowers, and also the ways how things can be fixed, then also coming out, if something small happens and you come out, I think can be seen as more positive. But if you are treated as a spy by the power, people, even if they don't like the power, still listen to it, adhere. They're also afraid of it. So it really, I think the fight, the work that Transparency is now taking on to really push for European-wide legislation is worth taking, because as you were speaking, I went to check. We have sections on all the countries of that don't have the laws, and apparently France, even they protected you, is still a very bad place for French whistleblowers in the public sector. And we can go on and on, which countries are really could do so much just to make this better.
Ironically, in 1997, when David and I were trying to work out where to flee, in order to remain free, in order to fight the case and argue the key points, because bear in mind, we had a lot to discuss, and we were the only ones who really knew the detail of how it actually worked on the inside. We wanted to stay free to fight the corner. The two countries we considered were France and the US. Now, nobody in their right mind would flee to the US now as a whistleblower. In fact, any sensible person goes to China or Russia.
Yeah, here.
Yes, hello. What I find interesting is that you talk about the name of your presentation is the new rock and roll. Isn't there a danger that that whistleblowers are going to look at this and say, "Whoa, I'm stuck in this dead-end job. I'm basically a loser, and if I do this, I will have instant celebrity status. I will Kardashianize myself, and that'll be the real motivation for what they're doing." Like Edward Snowden could very easily, in a few years, get out of his situation and just be an international celebrity and make millions giving speeches and so forth. Don't you think there's a danger in glamorizing this too much? And where's the quality control? I mean, just because somebody's a whistleblower, does that mean that they're given an instant forum? Do you understand what I'm saying? It's the glamorization of this and the danger of attracting posers and wannabes. Have you thought of this?
Well, there are plenty of people who do that. I think the key thing is if you can provide the proof, which is usually documentation, which is why, as I said, WikiLeaks has provided such a great service in the sense that you can protect that proof. The proof that David took was given to the newspaper, and the newspaper then had to hand it back under police production orders. And until the MI6 document was leaked from MI6 in 2000, it was very difficult to prove what we were saying. But I think what you're groping towards is the argument, the old accusation of narcissism. And it was interesting that you assume that everyone is in a dead-end job in intelligence and they want to have fame.
I didn't say everyone. I said some people might be in that situation and see a way out. See an immediate way out of their mediocre situation, and overnight they're international celebrities. You see.
I see what you're groping towards. I don't think international celebrity quite works. What you're facing is international notoriety, the ruin of your reputation, potentially a very long prison sentence. That's not really being a Kardashian, I don't think, whoever they are. I think so. It is a difficult one. David and I, for example, were high flyers. We always got performance-related pay while we were on the inside. We went into this job because we wanted to have a job that would make a difference. And even, I know it sounds pompous now, but I mean, we're in our 20s and we thought we'd have a job that could potentially save lives, because you're stopping terrorists. And I've met many intelligence whistleblowers since, the serious ones, not the slightly fringe theory people who might have other issues going on. And it's the same principle all the way through. You go in because you want to do something that will make a difference, and things go so badly wrong over a period of time, you think, well, this I can let slide, this might just be a one-off, and then you see cumulatively it getting worse. So you continue to want to make a difference. And you try raising it on the inside, and you're told to shut up and just follow orders repeatedly as well. And then what can you do? So I think it's that motivation is what takes you into the job that will potentially take you out of it in the same way. But it also depends on your life situation. So, for example, in 1996, this whole new generation of intelligence officers were recruited in the early 1990s as counterterrorism officers as the Cold War ended. And record numbers were flooding out at the same time for exactly the same reasons that David and I left. They were shocked, just appalled, actually, at some of the actions they were ordered to do, some of the lack of accountability, the mistakes, the lies. But many of them had other constraints around them, like young children or, wives or family and things. So they weren't as free, perhaps, to do what we could do. And it was interesting, again, with the Snowden case, that one of the reasons he outed himself, even though the information started coming out before a name was put to his face, was, he said, to stop a witch hunt, to stop his family being victimised, so he left them behind and put Clear Blue Water to stop a witch hunt within his organisation and with the NSA, where his former colleagues would be victimised. And I think that's very brave. And I don't think going on the run, losing your career prospects, never having a proper job again, etc., is really that glamorous an option. It was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek title, though, for this talk, Whistleblowing is the New Rock and Roll. Perhaps it was unwise. Blame Anders.
But I think what is important to have, besides the whistleblower, is the quality of the press. If you have, besides a cheap whistleblower, a cheap, and low-quality media professionals, it can really turn into a nightmare. I think the quality media, and the sources where that story would appear and the way the story would have been added to and vetted would be something, and that you're told that this took a year for the media also to trust it. It wasn't like, oh, I see it, I just run with it, and I don't care. So, and media quality all over the world, of course, is another issue on all of that, which is dropping for many reasons.
Absolutely, and it takes time, and if there's a number of stories, it may take a few years for them all to come out as well. But you can see the impact and the credibility of the whistleblower tends to be reflected by the pushback from the government as well. If you are a fantasist, that's it. They're just going to brush you aside and shh, don't listen. If you're not, they're going to come after you with full weight of the law and pursue you. So I don't think there's any doubt that Snowden is a real whistleblower, should we say.
Okay, I have a question which is not exactly related to the whistleblower, but it's just very personally interested. Because recently the rise of the far-right parties in Europe, and so do you think the Islamic culture gonna be in Europe gonna be a big problem in the future, and like as they propaganded or said, like?
I think that I'm not really an expert on that actually, but I think the way that some of our more right-wing press are trying to stoke it up can be a problem. Yeah, certainly in the UK, and perhaps many other countries, but I'm not really want to comment further.
Since Snowden is the topic of the day, I want to have a question about that. What do you say to people who say that he has somewhat undercut his credibility by looking for protection in China and Russia, which are not exactly bastions of free speech and civil rights, and do much worse to their citizens? I mean, not that I'm, speaking out in favor of the UK or the US, but I think living there is much more restricting than living in the Western countries.
I think it's ironic that he felt that he would be protected better there. Yeah, sure, they are no angels when it comes to press freedoms and human rights, but then actually is the US these days, when you look at what they've pushed through over the last decade. The NDAA, where they can summarily arrest and hold indefinitely even UK citizens within the US citizens within the US. I mean, they've been doing this to everyone else, if they wanted to, since 9/11. Where we have drone strikes, where we have CIA kill lists, which are signed off by the president and not overseen by any judicial process, where they have secret courts for surveillance. How precisely is that different from China and Russia now? Think about it. I just think it's really sad. I mean, the original notion of the Constitution and basic rights in the US was fantastic, but it's been so corroded since 9/11. That's been such a pretext to shred the Constitution with the Patriot Act, etc. I mean, as I said, in the UK, we don't have a written constitution, so they could do what they wanted to do anyway. But, I just think it's ironic he had to go there. And I don't think it's a reflection on him. I think it's a reflection on the US, that he felt the only two countries that had potentially the clout to resist the overweening might of the US are those two now. In fact, it's probably better he didn't go to Latin America, because those countries might not be as able to protect him.
You said that the friends and relatives of whistleblowers were arrested without any particular reason in order to pressure the whistleblowers. So how were these wrongful arrests justified in the legal framework? For example, within the law force itself, did they not realize that there was no actual legal basis for these arrests?
It doesn't really matter. Once they've arrested, they've arrested. So they got David's brother and his two best friends on trumped-up financial charges, money laundering, because we didn't know where we were going. So we gave them some money and said, can you hold it and send it to us by wire transfer wherever we end up, sort of thing. And that's what they arrested them on. And of course, there was no legal case. They dropped it. With Glenn Greenwald's partner, I think they saw him as some sort of information mule. He might potentially be taking information back from Berlin to Glenn Greenwald or something. But using a terrorism law for that, on the very nebulous basis that information he may potentially be holding may potentially, if published potentially at some point, be of use to our terrorist enemies potentially, even though we can't define who our terrorist enemies are necessarily. That was a pretty nebulous reason to stop someone for a maximum of 9 hours when he's transiting a country's airport. He's not even going into that country or through border control. So that was pretty crazy. But I think arresting and stigmatizing the relatives or friends or family of any dissident or whistleblower is a perfectly standard intimidation technique. It's been used by oppressive regimes, both East and West, for decades, centuries. And that's what we're seeing increasingly openly, perhaps, in the West, whereas in the past they tried to keep it slightly more sort of quiet and behind the scenes and, oh, well, you know, old chap, don't do this because otherwise your brother won't get this job or something. It certainly happened, you know, of course, in places like Russia and China before, but I suppose what frightens me is the sort of helter-skelter way that our notional Western democracies have gone down this effectively draconian totalitarian sort of mindset where they feel they can do this to their citizens.
Yeah, I just wanted to continue about Russia, why Snowden's staying there. Don't you think that the only reason why Russia allowed him to stay there is not because of their human rights or anything, but just some politics, international relations?
Oh, of course. I mean, you know, Putin must be cock-a-hoop. He can show that he is more liberal than the president of the US, of course. That doesn't mean that just because the potential reason he's doing it might not be attractive, doesn't mean the action's not right, though, I think. And, you know, Edward Snowden apparently did want to try and just transit Russia and get to Ecuador, which had offered him proper asylum, and then was stopped. Interestingly, do you remember the case of Evo Morales' plane, the president of Bolivia? So he was at some summit in Moscow around the same time, got on his presidential, diplomatically protected presidential, you know, super-duper plane to fly home, and then someone put a rumour out that Snowden might be on it to get him to Latin America, and suddenly the whole of European airspace was closed to his diplomatic plane, and it had to be landed in Vienna and searched by the European police. So one, that's highly embarrassing. I think it was very clever gameplay by someone who's probably quite a good chess player to flush out what the European response would be if Snowden tried to transit European airspace. So, you know, congrats to anyone who thought that one up.
Thank you for your being here, and for, as a UK, you're still alive, thank God. One question I ask myself, no matter how worthy the cause is that you come forward for, don't you see yourself afterwards a bit like Don Quixote? In this sense that, okay, you are making a pin in the, put it cruelly, in the back of the big elephant, but there is so much at stake. If you say that Blair and company, we all know with the Iraq war how they made the information fit their plan. So if all that is at stake, anything is possible. And as we see in Syria at the moment, the stories, the build-up, the climax and the declimax at the moment, and now having so-called Putin who says, well, it is the Contras who put out the gas in order to, etc., to, how should I say, to damage the image of Assad and to trigger the reaction of the West. So if you see how the whole thing is fabricated, and if you take the United States, if you want to be brainwashed, watch American TV. Sorry if there is any representative of that medium in the room. Yeah? If they say it's white, better think it's black, and I'm sure you're very close to the reality at that time. So how do you feel as a Don Quixote?
Yeah, definitely. I've chased a few windmills in my time. No, I mean, nothing ever really seems to change. That is the tragedy of it. And certainly the whistleblowing I was involved in was too early. I mean, it was the late 1990s, the internet was in its infancy. So most of the material then is lost. However, I think the landscape has changed a bit with the spread of the internet, and new generations growing up, not trusting necessarily one form of media, but always trying to cherry-pick different issues. So I think the culture is changing perhaps around this, and there is a distrust of what our governments say about things like Syria now, and the way that there wasn't in the run-up to the Iraq War. We've learned. So slowly, I think things will shift. Whether that means things will shift in the meaningful sense that we can, that the powers will also shift and reflect the times, is another matter. I suppose one option is, well, you know, America is bankrupt, it's militarily overstretched. How long can it continue to do this stuff in the Middle East? Might be another reason for it to go. But no, I do agree with that, and it's rather sad to look back and think all that effort. Like with the Gaddafi plot, the reason we went public, and then they do it anyway in public in 2011. I think there must be a very dangerous age. It's the late 20s if you're an intelligence officer, and you go in very idealistic in your early 20s, and then you have a number of years under your of experience, and you think, now this is going wrong, I'm going to use that idealism and do something different and affect change, and I can because I'm in my 20s, yay. Like Edward Snowden, like, you know, me, like many other whistleblowers. And, yeah, you learn. And I think they should ban 29-year-olds from working for the spies. Give them all a mandatory sabbatical year.
I have a question to Ines. Apart from NEO, from in press in Latvia, do you know of any whistleblowers in Latvia, and how other whistleblowers in Latvia, and how did they fare?
During our study that we produced on Latvia, and it is on our website, Down.lv, we talked about 3 cases. And the second was in the Ombudsman office, where a lot of things were happening, and it was a previous ombudsman, and and she, because of speaking against what was happening, she was fired, and she went to court and won the court cases. It wasn't around the whistleblowing protection, so basically she was fired and reinstalled. She was fired because of what she was doing. What she was talking about in the office. As a third example was about the police, and the police that uncovered wrongdoings of their colleagues. And earlier we also know of this fireman in the rural area near Bauska. And all of these cases actually end with sad endings. When we know there has been a question raised by these people, whistleblown. So we are really concerned. So we're not surprised. It's not really happening. And now really looking at every case that happens so that we can protect these people with the public support if things happen. Because the labor law in Latvia sort of protects people's rights. And actually the civil service law obliges them to report any wrongdoings. Actually, most of the European countries, all the civil servants has this obligation of reporting. The question is what happens when they really do that. So that ranks Latvia among not the worst, just in the middle of maybe potential for doing something.
But there is one good example about the vote rigging in Latvala, where the woman, where the ballot box was being stuffed.
Yes, that was the Central Election Commission, and it was 6 years ago or so. And she really reported that. I have to repeat it for everyone. And she reported the vote rigging during the municipal elections, and the criminal case was started, and the guy who was in charge of all of that went to prison and served his prison years. So and nothing happened to her. She worked in a good organization, Central Election Commission, but there are many cases we don't know about because the system works. In some places where they have, unfortunately, there are no real safe places for our officials to report. In the way that then system can react. Usually the only chance is to report to the boss, and that's a little bit like you told, if you report to the boss what is going to happen. There are these anonymous phone call services, and I think we have to see how that works. So there are a little bit of chances to, in Latvia, to use that base as a system.
I wanted to continue further on the revolution you told, the WikiLeaks revolution, the new media. But don't you think there is another revolution in the Secret Service agency field? Maybe there's a revolution for the whistleblower. Maybe it is harder to be a whistleblower at the moment because of the revolution on the other side. And the second question I wanted to ask is maybe, do you feel any willingness of revenge from your former employees? Like to punish you in some way. Still, do you feel anything of that? Because you talked about the email in Switzerland and other measures of precaution.
Yes, I think the pushback against whistleblowers is hard and fast. In fact, there was a document written by the DOJ in America called The Insider Threat in 2008. This was soon after WikiLeaks was established. So most people only think WikiLeaks came out in 2010 with all the sort of data dumps of the Middle Eastern documents. They've been around since 2008, reporting all sorts of horrors around the world, not just governmental stuff, but big business. And the American government woke up very fast to this new threat and wrote a think piece about it. And now this has been reinforced. In fact, this document was leaked to WikiLeaks in 2010, ironically. Saying, watch out for insiders. But now this has been reinforced post-Snowden. They're now putting out other documents as well about the insider threat, and they're getting their staff to spy on each other. If someone so-and-so is expressing their annoyance at a boss's decision, or so-and-so is expressing concern about a policy decision in the department, they might be about to blow the whistle, so they're an insider threat. So what we're looking at is a sort of global McCarthyism now. You remember in the 1950s, McCarthyism, when they went after the communists. Now they're after the whistleblowers. So, yes, the pushback is much more severe. And I think it's very interesting watching what Snowden did and how he did it. Because he is a geek, and he knows the technology, and he knows what he's up against, and he played it very carefully and very well. So he could work around those sort of blockages. He was aware of what he was up against. And I think that's what we're going to see with a new generation of whistleblowers. Just a new generation generally, There's a very good piece, if you want to Google it, it's by a writer called Charles Stross. And I think he wrote it for a magazine called Foreign Policy, which was looking at this generational shift in the sense that the baby boomers expected a job for life, they were loyal to their organisation, they were loyal to the notion of their nation state, and if they went to work for the NSA, that was it. Generation X, of course, which is sort of 60s, 70s, didn't expect to have a job for life, but was still fairly loyal. And then Generation Y, so-called the slackers, tended to be more, geeky, and they'd move around from job to job, and that's why most of the people working in intelligence now are contractors in the US and the UK. So they're not expected to be loyal to one agency for the rest of their life. They're not going to be. Why should they be? Because they're cast aside as soon as the work dries up. So, and then his view was Generation Z, which is the sort of, digital natives born in the last decade. What the hell are they going to think about loyalty to the NSA or MI5 or the nation state or whatever? It's a very interesting article. So yes, whistleblowers are the new insider threat. In terms of how they come after you, it's a difficult one because the whistleblowing years, we knew we were being watched. We knew our telephones were being intercepted. We knew email. We even found out that some of our friends were pressurised into reporting against us. So it was like living under the Stasi at one point. We couldn't even trust that we could have a private conversation in our flat or in our bedroom because it might be bugged. You don't know, but it might be. And that is a very corrosive way to live, the sense of having no privacy. And now, of course, we're all facing that with the NSA disclosures. So that's what we're all up against. But I can't quite shift that. I never can. And I think that's the problem because I've worked with a number of other whistleblowers from the US intelligence agencies. They never get that out of their head either, the sense they might be watched. And it's difficult. I'm not doing anything illegal. I'm just talking about stuff that's already in the public domain. I'm speaking out about civil liberties and things, but I can't guarantee that I'm not seen as a a domestic extremist, potentially. You know, because we have seen this in many countries. People who are activists, the goalposts shift, and suddenly you're not an activist, you're a domestic extremist. And then somehow you're a violent extremist, and somehow you might be a terrorist. And if you think that sounds fanciful, Occupy in London 2 years ago, a letter was leaked from the City of London police that went out to all the big banks in that area, saying Occupy is deemed by us, the police, to be a domestic extremist / terrorist organisation. Please implement your security measures appropriately. This is a bunch of hippies and some tents. So this is how the goalposts can shift. So just because you think you're doing nothing wrong doesn't mean that they think you're doing nothing wrong. So exercise your rights before you lose them.
Hans, can I ask a question? Hans, can I ask? I wanted to ask you, has there been any discussion of including, at least partially, the security agencies into the whistleblower protection in the UK?
Not that I'm aware of, no. In fact, it's probably gone backwards. I mean, if you work as an intelligence officer in MI5 or MI6 or GCHQ, you actually sign away your employment rights when you join the organisation. You're not allowed to belong to any sort of federation or union or anything like that. So you have to trust that they will abide by the law and treat you decently. And then if you then blow the whistle or something, you're screwed, effectively. So I think it's actually going backwards, and this new insider threat meme that's coming out is making it more difficult for people to have that conversation. Having said that, I've worked with a number of whistleblower protection groups in the UK, looking at people coming out of the National Health Service or the banks. I mean, there's a lot of whistleblowers out there, not just spooks. And they all say the same thing, you know, they get intimidated, they get sacked, or they, you know, can't carry on working, or, you know, they're prosecuted or whatever. It's very, very sad across the board. And they all say that despite having this Public Interest Disclosure Act in the UK, it doesn't provide meaningful protection for them coming out of those areas either. So it's meaningless legislation. It's a sort of sticking plaster, and it hasn't worked terribly well, even for people from mainstream jobs.
Do you think that the Boston bombings were really organized by those two brothers, or were there any political motivations behind it?
I don't know specifically about that one, I have to say. Certainly there is no doubt that intelligence agencies get involved in dirty tricks. It's a perfectly standard weapon they use. They have done for decades, if not centuries. For example, the ousting of President Mossadegh in Iran, Persia, in 1953. Finally, the CIA has actually apologized for doing that. You know, we had Libya, which was effectively dirty tricks. It was false flag attack. We had the Israeli embassy bombing in 1994 in London. The Russian spy, do you remember Alexander Litvinenko, who was murdered in London with polonium a few years ago? He was always called a dissident. He was a whistleblower. He fled Russia, ironically, to the UK to blow the whistle. How times change. And what he blew the whistle on was that the modern incarnation of the KGB had bombed 2 apartment blocks in Moscow in 1999 and blamed Chechen rebels. And that was the pretext the Russia needed to invade Chechnya. So, I mean, it goes on everywhere. It's perfectly normal. So I don't know specifically about the Boston bombings. I haven't actually had that much time recently to look into it too much. But I would suggest that every time something major happens and there's a huge pushback against it, you know, do your own research and digging, because sometimes it is as it appears. There are real terrorist threats out there, and sometimes they will be exaggerated for political advantage, and sometimes they might be not what they appear to be. So just don't always believe what you read in the mainstream media, even if you're a journalist.
Well, it's getting close to 7, but we have one final question here.
I'm the lucky one. My question is very related to this answer, that there are a lot of misinformation around. How can we spot it in time when tomorrow there will be some big headline, and how we can be sure that it's a real case or misinformation?
It's a damn good question and very difficult to answer. I think it's just looking for patterns. So few people I mean, because I read a lot. I mean, this is an area I research a lot, so I'm very aware of things that might have happened 5, 10, 20 years ago. And then you can see patterns. But obviously people have to get on with their daily lives, and they're not going to be obsessively reading up about this stuff. But some of the big patterns are pretty obvious now, I think. Like, you know, weapons of mass destruction as a reason for humanitarian intervention in Middle Eastern countries, of dictatorships. I mean, where do you finish with that? So I think those sort of memes you can pick up quite easily. It's just if you get a sense that something might not be quite right or whatever, just have a little delve on the internet. There's a lot of rubbish out there, but there's some very good commentators as well. I mean, someone mentioned earlier that you can't necessarily trust the mainstream media in the US. No, you can't, and certainly not Fox News. Jesus. I mean, propaganda, anyone? And then a lot of Americans will say that RT, Russia Today, is propaganda because it's a Russian state-sponsored channel. Well, yeah, it probably is about a lot of Russian stuff, but it gives a different perspective on a lot of Middle Eastern stuff. And if you juxtapose that with Fox or the BBC or Al Jazeera, you might get a more rounded view, and you can make up your own mind. The trouble is, of course, we all get flooded with daily life and jobs and exams and whatever. It's very difficult to even absorb all that. And then, if you are concerned about it, decide what you can meaningfully do and find the time to care and do it. There are some very good writers out there, if you're interested in spy stuff. Ex-CIA Ray McGovern does a lot of very good writing. He's wonderful. He's a veteran spy and out there and fired up and campaigning. My website is anniemachon.ch, Swiss. Tom Drake is very good. He's former NSA. Of course, there's a mountain of information on WikiLeaks that you can delve through. Glenn Greenwald is very good. I rate him. But it's just reading round. If you find a subject or an issue that really stirs you up, then look at different outlets, media outlets and sites, and see where it intersects, perhaps. Never trust one source.
Thank you so much for coming and listening, and thank you so much, Inese and Annie, for coming here. Thank you.